announcing the 1916 Company app, fully redesigned, available on the Apple App Store and Google Play, combining new watches from many brands with more being added all the time, and our traditionally vast collection of pre-owned luxury timepieces. A redesigned homepage, a natural departure point for trading, browsing our inventory, and checking out our studio originals. Build your online wish list, a virtual collection that allows you to leverage all of the makes, models, and reference numbers in our databases. And seamless trading. Contact your advisor, forward pictures, get an estimate, and choose your next match from our vast online inventory. All of this on the 1916 Company app, available on Google Play and the Apple App Store.
Welcome back to another episode of Perpetually Patek. I am joined today by Tim Masso, who I am sure all of you are well acquainted with. And today we are making the case for small case watches.
I see what you did there.
A little bit of a pun.
All right, okay. The case for small case watches. There was a time, once upon a time, when almost everything was made in what we would consider to be a small case today. Historically, you could have watches anywhere from 30 to 36 millimeters, and those were worn by men, and that included complications. So I guess philosophically, what is a small case today? I would say vintage watches first, but then watches that are made sort of in the tradition of vintage timepieces that never gave up those smaller sizes, or maybe even returned them later on.
Yeah, no, and today we are very much seeing a trend moving back towards smaller case watches, which is why both of us wanted to have this discussion. And so I think that if you would ask most of the watch buying world, they would say that small watches now are somewhere between, at least for men, are somewhere between the sizes of 38 and 40 millimeters. Above 40, more or less a standard size, right? You have your 5711, right, is probably not quite big, not quite small. You start moving towards the 42 millimeter Pateks, which is probably let's call it a normalized size, right? Nobody would really describe a 42 millimeter Patek as necessarily big these days. But I would say if you were to ask a Patek buyer today, what is a smaller size watch? Sub 40.
Now what I see in, I guess, the realm of what we would consider small is that this is now sort of a no man's land. Or by that, I mean men and women, actually. So it's all man's land. The idea of having a watch that's maybe more of a mid-size, so take something like the 5269, the Aquanaut Luce travel time that came out this year. Now, today, the Aquanaut is as big as 42.2 in the chronograph form and the white gold form. And back in 1998, we got a 38.8 millimeter case, and that's exactly what the 5269 is. Now, it's quartz, but it's not explicitly a ladies' watch or a men's watch. It's sort of a unisex option. It's a fun travel time. It's an intermediate size. It would look good just about on any wrist size. So you've got that going on. Again, both can enjoy. You've got the 7234, which came out in 2018, which took the 5524 Calatrava Pilot, and it scaled it down to 37.5, which I think is a really great size for right now. And although initially pitched as a ladies' version of the Calatrava Pilot travel time, later on, particularly with the steel model that was launched during the Singapore exhibition, it became much more clear that this was just a great all-around size.
Correct. The co-pilot, as I like to say.
Exactly. So we've got it in white gold, we've got it in rose gold, we've got it in steel, and this is now considered something that either a man or a woman would wear. And while I love the 5524, I do think it's just a little bit too big for me. So I'm really grateful for that intermediate option.
Yeah.
And then finally, 2 years ago, another one of these watches that I think can go either way, a little bit of a throwback to the 5036. We got the 4947, steel full bracelet, 38 millimeters, a really cool Shantung rug style dial. And this is one of those watches that I think back in 2005, 6, 7, when everything was huge, this really would have cut against the grain. And this is sort of that move toward the middle now that more ladies are getting interested in traditional mechanical watchmaking, and a lot of men who maybe don't want to get into the complexities of vintage are looking at as new watch options.
Correct. No, and so this idea of unisex sizing, I think, is just becoming more and more pervasive, not just with Patek, but amongst all brands. And for me, You've mentioned some other models, but I would say it became abundantly clear when they launched the 5261 Rose Aquanaut. So at 39.9 millimeters, annual counter complication, it was really the first complicated Aquanaut designed for women, right? No diamonds. And so, but what they quickly realized is that obviously at 39.9 millimeters, I mean, this could very much be classified as a gentleman's watch, given that the stainless steel time-only Aquanaut is 40.8. And so this watch is now being purchased by both male and female collectors and is doing incredibly well. And so I think that what we see is that there's a demand for these size watches, and there's, I think, also a demand for watches that are even smaller than this. Because as we start taking a look at vintage references, such as the 565 and moving on, from that, watches used to be called 34 millimeters all the way up to 38 millimeters, right? 38 being a larger size watch. And it wasn't until the early 90s, well, I guess if you separate out the Genta designs, the early 90s, that you really saw this explosion in watch size.
And it's important that you mentioned some of those smaller sizes, because people forget the 96 ran for about 4 decades. And the end of 96 production and the arrival of the 40 millimeter 3700 Nautilus Jumbo in 1976, it's only about 4 or 5 years. And we began to see this ramp up in the size of sports watches that started in the 70s but really hit its stride in the 90s. In 1993 alone, we got the Royal Oak Offshore, and we got the first civilian market Panerai watches. Now 42 to 44 millimeters. Those were ahead of their time, there's no doubt about that. But at the time, Patek Philippe was still purely traditional, and while it would get bigger with 5980 to 5990, it never quite got to that size. So what I think is interesting is that a lot of watches we would consider small today aren't as old as the 96. The 96 is an old timer. But something from the 1990s can really be viewed through the lens of smaller case size. My favorite from this period is going to be something that's a little bit quirky, but very much in the Patek tradition, the Officer's Watch Cased 5059 of 1998, where you've got the retrograde date, you've got the aperture style perpetual calendar, very similar to the fun but more Calatrava inflected 5050 of the early 90s. I really like old versions of the 5059 because I feel like with the 5159, it's a 38, it's not large, but because of the officer's case lugs, all you need is a 36. And for me, I look better in a 5059 than a 5159.
I would say from a watch size perspective, 34 to 39 millimeter tends to fit my wrist best. When I start getting above 40, I really feel like the watches are a little bit big. And again, watch sizing is really a personal comfort choice, right? But one thing that I very much notice is that, as you mentioned, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s, right? For Patek at least, like 35 to 39 millimeters, was the size. And so we're now seeing a trend moving back downwards. But why that works and why that can happen is that a lot of the imagery, a lot of the iconic models are smaller, and clients are used to seeing these smaller sized watches, and it almost feels like a tribute back towards these pieces.
And I do think it's fun to kind of enjoy modern small size cases, because there are a handful of very precious and rare and hallowed references that Patek has launched post 21st century. And I gotta be honest, I love the 5959. It's a historic piece because it was Patek's first in-house chronograph built from scratch. But at 33 millimeters, it's another example of one of those watches where you really have to take the shape of the case and the lugs into account. Though with 33, this is another officer's watch style case. You have these very strong, straight, welded lugs in the fashion of a converted pocket watch. So the watch is a 33, like that 59, it's going to wear a size or two larger, so it's got a lot of personality. Now, if you look at the 2008 to 2016 Platinum model, the Dash 11, you've now got something that wears a little bit bigger. It's got a punchy black dial and a white metal case, and it's got a pleasing weight to it. And to me, the ultimate confidence is to have a monster watch in a small package.
Exactly. And I think that when you look at different eras of watchmaking, there was a competition to see who could make, let's call it, the most complicated watch in the thinnest, smallest size. And it became a testament to the brand and to the model that they were able to take, for example, in the 3939, a tourbillon minute repeater and have it be in a 34 millimeter case, right? So that was a big deal. That was something that a lot of the other brands were not able to accomplish or not able to do. And so as we've seen the sizes of these grand complications get larger, right? There's both the consumer preference for those larger size watches that took place over time, but that once this was accomplished, a lot of the advancements weren't necessarily in simply making it smaller, it was in materials using silicium, things that we've talked about on other episodes, and so that these were advancements being done to the movement itself outside of size.
And I'll also say this, for some people, you've got a really big wrist, there's going to be a feeling that size is relative. The 50-59 to me might be the 51-59 to you, which is a 38, but again, you're talking those officer's watch style lugs. The 50-40 of the 1990s, like if you're talking about a form watch from Patek Philippe where you've got a perpetual calendar and a tonneau, you know, some ways you measure that, you can get 35 millimeters. It doesn't wear like a 35 millimeter watch. So for something like a 59-40, which is the larger size, the 50-40 fits me. If you've got a really big wrist, if you want to get the same proportion where it's compact, it looks traditional, but it's still matched to your physiology, something like then a 51-59 or a 59-40 might be right for you. We're not saying everyone needs the tiniest possible watch. We're just saying pegging back size from what looks big on your wrist is often how we regard smaller sizes. And again, very traditional. I think that's just making a vintage statement. I think that's saying, maybe I don't want to get into vintage, but I do like the aesthetic of it.
No, and I think that ultimately, as you mentioned, that the sizing is a preference, right? If you're used to larger watches, anything smaller that you put on your wrist is going to feel small until you would wear that watch and wear it regularly. For me, I generally think that it takes around 3 days to get used to the size of a new watch on your wrist if you're not used to having worn that size. So if I started wearing a 44 millimeter watch, I may consistently find it too big, and it would take me a little bit of time to get used to the watch. I'm wearing, for example, this is something that I snagged from the box. This is a 32 millimeter 3520 on an integrated bracelet. And at 32 millimeters, by no means do I feel like this watch is too small on me. And something like this on an integrated bracelet, you can pick up for less than $15,000. And I just think that there's so much value in these types of watches, both from even just what you're getting to the aesthetic.
And what I really like about that, aside from the fact that it's a gold case, gold bezel, gold dial, and gold bracelet, so it really looks like a integrated band, the survival of that incredibly fine silk-like mesh. Like those kind of bracelets, they don't survive because people kink them. This one that you've got on your wrist right now looks like a piece of fabric. There isn't a single kink or bend or flaw in that bracelet. And it's an unusual watch because while there are a lot of 3520s in the world, the fully welded in integrated bracelet is a rarity, and it takes an incredible amount of skill to make that bracelet.
You're selling me on it right now.
You know, I love the thing. Like you pulled that on me just before the show, and I'm like, congratulations. You're like, well, it's not mine just yet. It might be yours, but that's a really neat piece. And again, because the integration of the bracelet is not perfectly flexible. It's going to wear a little bit larger than, say, a 35 millimeter watch ordinarily would.
Yeah. So I think that a lot of times collectors get caught up in millimeter size, which is something that we talk about on prior episodes, where a watch can be a certain size and fit larger or fit smaller depending upon the case or the model itself. And I think that there are a lot of smaller watches from the past that have a bigger presence on the wrist, mostly because of these big, robust lugs that the watches had. And so you mentioned the 50-59 in this officer style case.
A split-second chrono.
It has these lugs coming off the watch that really gives it more presence. And so I think that it's something that if a collector's looking at the size, they think right off the bat, wow, that's too small. These are things that need to get on the wrist.
Yeah, there's a couple things to keep in mind with the fit of a watch. It's going to be the shape of the watch, the shape of the lugs, lug to lug, and thickness. And you might be surprised with any officer style watch. Patek has a lot of them. They always wear a size or two larger, so that's something to take into account. I would also say that there are some really great recent Patek Philippe small size cases, and all 21st century here. But back in 2001 until about 2016, Patek had the 5120 in the catalog. Now, a lot to love here. 35 millimeters is a very versatile size. It's great for him. It's great for her. It's one of the only standard time-only Calatravas to have a micro-rotor automatic movement in it. Almost every other Patek dress watch in this size and format was a 215 manual wind, and generally with a solid case back. So if you can get into something like a 5120, you have a real upscale Patek movement, a very versatile case size, a watch that you won't see every day. Despite the long production run, there's not a million of these floating around. They're not as common as a 3919, they're not as common as a 5119. And it's a really substantial piece. It's proof that you really can get the full Patek experience with just two hands in a smaller case. You don't need to have a grand comp.
Yeah, and I think too, what the brand has done so remarkably well is they will launch a model and then they have the ability to discontinue that model and then relaunch it in a relevant version to the time, right? And so, I use, for example, the World Time, right? They had the 5130, it was at 40 millimeters. It came out at a time, it came after the 5110, which is a smaller watch. And so they launched that watch to be a 40 millimeter World Time version that was suited as the trends were moving up. And then as trends started moving back, they launched the 5230. And so this was a now called 38 and change World Time, but it had slightly bigger lugs, so it fit really nicely. And now you're seeing with the addition of the date function that the sizing is moving back up again. And so, but I think that they're very good about consistently changing the model and having it just always be relevant.
And I think one of the great things about Patek Philippe is because the catalog is so deep and the history is so rich. If there's nothing in the current catalog you don't want, that's hard to imagine, but let's say you're just not at peace with the current offerings, you just go back one generation and now you've got that 38.5 millimeter case, or you go back two generations to something like the 5110, and now you really do have a traditional 36 type size. 36 and a half, 37, that's a watch that's going to be very, very different and more traditional in the way it wears. I think that came out in 2000. That was like really the end of strictly traditional 33 to 36 millimeter sizing in the general production Patek catalog. But not the total end. There is one watch I want to throw out there. Everyone knows the 5119, but there's the somewhat less common 5116, which is almost the same in every way, but it's got a Grand Faux enamel dial. The white gold model, in 2009 to 2013, a really special piece and probably one of the most accessible ways to get into a métier d'art, a manual craft art Patek Philippe, where one part was made by an artisan who just makes that kind of part.
One of the only watches, only time-only references to feature a full enamel dial. And what's so interesting about that watch is when it was currently in production, in tandem to the 5119, it was often viewed as why am I going to necessarily pay this extra money for the enamel, right? And now we think to ourselves like, wow, like we wish we had more time-only watches with enamel dials, and it doesn't even matter how much more the price is. But I think that what you spoke to about having these older pieces from the 90s, early 2000s, even late 80s, right, is I don't consider these vintage, right? I really consider these like nouveau vintage, right? Because if they still have a modern feel to them in terms of both like the efficiency of the movements and then the case construction and even the dial. And so you can see how today's watches have grown from them. And then you can see how those watches grew from the watches that are truly vintage. But you're correct, like you have a whole back catalog of these watches in 35 to 39 millimeters that are fantastic and really do offer, I think, tremendous value.
Now, a great thing about Patek Philippe watchmaking is that as we sort of saw the transition from Henri Stern's long governance of the company to Philippe Stern, late 80s, early 90s, we see this explosion in highly complicated watchmaking, 3939, 5020, 5016, all sorts of perpetual calendars in every format. In 1996, we got the 5004 split-second perpetual calendar chronograph, Caliber 89 back in 1989. It just went on, proving that you actually can get a top-of-the-line Grail-level Patek Philippe with all of the trimmings in one of these traditional case sizes. Because if you go back to 1992 and the original 5016, that's still basically the movement that is in today's 5316. The case is bigger now, the dials are more sophisticated, Patek is now making the case itself, but back then, you know, Jean-Pierre Hagman would have made the case, Patek would have made the movement, and you've got a tourbillon, and you've got a retrograde perpetual calendar, and a moon phase, and a minute repeater, and this whole thing, the entire package, it's 36.2 millimeters.
No, I mean, for me, I find the 5016 to just be a absolute, like, still stealth watch. I mean, tremendously undervalued relative for what it is, the size of the watch, the aesthetic. I think that this is going to be a watch that, you know, while appreciated in some smaller circles or smaller collecting circles, that, you know, fast forward, there's going to be a, oh my God, I can't believe or remember when it was this price.
Yeah, I would say that too, because relative to what you would pay for, you know, like a new 5316, I think going for something that's out of production, if you're strictly a collector and you're doing it on that basis, that's always where I look first, because if some auction catalog or blog or celebrity discovers the watch before you do, you know, you're kind of out of luck. Whereas if a watch is still on sale, you've always got that hope of putting in an order and having it fulfilled.
Well, the current 5316/50, I mean, is arguably like one of my, I mean, it's one of my favorite watches that's like in production by any brand anywhere.
But also acknowledge that after the 5216, when it came time to renew the model, they're like, well, what direction should we take? And they're like, well, let's go back to the 5016, larger case, but the same proportions.
Yeah, and I think that exactly. But what they did so remarkably well, and then we can move off this watch, is they took a very traditional aesthetic with the retrograde and said, how do we modernize this? Like, how do we take this watch and make it more relevant to an even younger consumer or somebody that wants something a little bit more casual? And they did that just dark sapphire crystal. And it's just like, sometimes like when a watch hits in every facet it hits, and this watch to me just hits.
So with the 5016, every 5016 is the ultimate 5016, so I'm actually going to push that aside. That's too easy. Let's talk about our grails, where we've got to pick favorites among these smaller references, and variants matter. So you go first.
Okay, so to start, I am going to go with a 3939. So I am stealing that from you.
Okay, fair enough.
But I believe that Patek produces by far and away the best minute repeaters in the world. And so from a sizing perspective, at 30 more millimeters, it fits me flawlessly. It also features a tourbillon complication. It was one of the most complicated watches that they were producing at the time, and they sound beautiful. So I would say as far as variants go, it would probably be the 3939P, platinum with a black dial, would be like my grail of grails.
That's an awesome piece. I will say this, if you do go for one with a white dial, there are some enamel white dials out there, which adds another layer of richness to the 3939. And I love the 5059, but the white gold 5059G that was made after the end of production, the Dash 18, white gold case, salmon dial. Now we've got that officer's watch with the Hunter case back. We've got the retrograde perpetual calendar, the 36 millimeter case. And because these were essentially revival pieces
for the London exhibition.
Exactly. The Saatchi Gallery exhibition in 2015, older movements that were Geneva hallmark were cased up for this revival model because the regular production of the 5059 ended after 2006. So it was brought back with other references in 2015, and a very small number were made white gold with a salmon dial with new old stock Geneva hallmark, not Patek Philippe seal, but Geneva hallmark movements in 2015. And those are so scarce, it's hard to even find a picture of them. I do not envy the production crew. But if I could have one, just one, I would watch it on my wrist, not on my screen.
I will end with one more. So I would say that this is probably a little bit more modern than Nouveau Vintage, but and one just went at auction this past week would be the 5550P Advanced Research Perpetual Calendar from Patek. So I love the ultra thin, smaller perpetual, and I am a big fan of that, like that vertical satin look, that silver look with the rose gold accents. I just think they offer such a beautiful contrast, and it is a watch that truly just stands the test of time. It is as relevant now as it was then, and I just think it is perfectly executed, and it also has that added bonus of being a limited edition.
That and all the early advanced research watches were calendar watches. They were annual calendars though. The 5550 was the perpetual, and just because of the way it looks, it's a classic. The fact that it was also the watch that brought together all the elements of the advanced research technologies, from the hairspring to the oscillator, the very rarely seen Gyromax SI balance wheel, that really is a capstone to any collection. Fantastic. Brian, people want to find us, where can they find us?
They can find us at the1916company.com or the 1916 Company on Instagram.
And I am Tim_Masso on Instagram. Until next time, time out.